The Republican Party is quickly becoming the party of child suffering. Under their leadership and because of their policies, children are sick from cuts to Medicaid and the end of the ACA subsidies. They're hungry from cuts to SNAP. They're orphaned by violently abducting their parents. They're criminalized and strip searched at the border, and now they're denied life-saving gender-affirming care. Since my Republican colleagues seem confused about what love, what care, and what protection looks like, let me be very clear. The Protect Children's Innocence Act is not it. No one who causes or tolerates the suffering of children can claim to be their protector. Love for our children would ensure each of them have every single thing they need to thrive assured to them. So I want to urge my colleagues here in the House of Representatives to vote no.
Listen to what this woman just said, because this is the voice you will not hear on Fox News or from Republican leadership or in any safe, sanitized corner of the American political landscape where we are told to debate civilly and reasonably as if we aren't watching children suffer in real time, while politicians congratulate themselves for cruelty dressed up as policy. Representative Delia Ramirez just delivered a floor speech that should echo through every hall of power and every household in America, because what she articulated with such precision and moral clarity is not hyperbole, it is not partisan exaggeration, it is the lived reality that millions of American children are experiencing under Republican governance, and we need to stop pretending otherwise. This bill literally just passed the House with a vote of 216 to 211, with 3 Democrats actually crossing over to vote with Republicans to criminalize life-saving health care. And you're about to understand why what Representative Ramirez said about the party of child suffering is not rhetoric but an empirical assessment of Republican priorities when they control legislative power in this country. Here's what just happened, and I need you to understand the magnitude of this moment, because the political press is going to sanitize it and both sides it into oblivion. The Protect Children's Innocence Act would make it a federal felony for providers to offer gender-affirming medical care to anyone under 18, with penalties of up to 10 years in prison, and this isn't some theoretical exercise in legislative process. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene's signature obsession now codified into legislation that would put doctors in federal prison for providing health care that major medical groups warn banning can endanger the mental health of transgender youth and increase risks of depression and suicide. We're talking about puberty blockers that are reversible. We're talking about mental health support. We're talking about treatments that every major medical association in the U.S., including the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics, supports providing as evidence-based and safe care. And Republicans just voted to make providing this care a felony offense with prison sentences that would destroy the lives of physicians who dare to follow medical science instead of Republican culture war hysteria. Let that absolutely marinate for a moment, because we are watching in real time the political weaponization of medicine, the legislative criminalization of healthcare, the federal government imposing itself between families and their doctors in the most invasive authoritarian way imaginable, and Republicans have the audacity to call this protecting children. The Supreme Court in June 2025 held that Tennessee's transgender medical care ban for youth is constitutional, effectively restricting access to gender-affirming medical care for thousands of transgender youth in 27 states, so we already have the judicial green light for this assault on medical autonomy, and now Republicans are going federal with it. They're not satisfied with state-level cruelty. They want to nationalize the suffering. They want to ensure that there is nowhere safe for transgender children and their families to access the health care that keeps them alive and healthy. As of July 2025, 40.1%, or 120,400 trans youth, aged 13 to 17, are living in the 27 states that have passed bans on gender-affirming care, and now the House of Representatives has voted to expand that prohibition nationwide with criminal penalties that would terrify any physician into compliance, regardless of what their medical training and ethical obligations demand. And here's where Representative Ramirez's speech becomes not just morally resonant, but analytically devastating, because she doesn't stop at this single piece of legislation. She contextualizes it within the broader Republican war on children that spans every dimension of social policy. The House Republican Reconciliation Bill would cut the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program by nearly $300 billion through 2034, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the largest amount in its history, and these aren't abstract budget numbers. These are meals that children will not eat. These are families that will go hungry. These are developmental outcomes that will be permanently compromised because Republican legislators decided that tax cuts for the wealthy matter more than food for poor children. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that expanding the work requirement would cut SNAP by $92 billion through 2034 and take food assistance away entirely from 3.2 million adults in a typical month, including 800,000 parents of school-aged children. And when you cut off parents from food assistance, you are cutting food from the mouths of their children. You are making childhood hunger a policy choice. You are deciding that children should suffer because their parents don't meet arbitrary work requirements that have nothing to do with actual employment opportunities or economic realities. When these adults are cut off SNAP, their entire households receive less in food benefits, and roughly 1 million children would see their food benefits cut substantially as a result. Think about what that means in concrete terms, because we need to stop allowing Republicans to hide behind euphemisms about fiscal responsibility and program reform. We're talking about children who will go to school hungry, who will struggle to concentrate in class because their stomachs are empty, who will fall behind academically, not because they lack intelligence or effort, but because their government decided that feeding them was less important than maintaining tax rates for people who own multiple homes and private jets. The cruelty is the point, as the saying goes, but it's worse than that because the cruelty is also the policy. It's the deliberate choice. It's the Republican governing philosophy made manifest in the bodies of hungry children who did nothing wrong except be born into families that needed assistance. And Representative Ramirez doesn't let them off the hook on health care either, because while Republicans are criminalizing gender-affirming care for transgender youth, they're simultaneously gutting Medicaid for millions of children who depend on it for basic health services. House Republicans are pushing to slash nearly $1 trillion from two of the nation's bedrock safety net programs, Medicaid and food stamps, and if the legislation is approved, millions of Americans could lose access to these benefits. The proposals would strip Medicaid coverage from more than 10 million people over 10 years, and overall an additional 7.6 million Americans are projected to be uninsured in 2034 because of the Medicaid provisions. And children make up a massive proportion of Medicaid beneficiaries because Medicaid is how poor children in this country access health care. It's how they get immunizations and well-child visits and treatment for asthma and diabetes and all the medical needs that every child has, regardless of their family's income level. The Congressional Budget Office estimates 4.2 million people will be uninsured in 2034 because House Republicans have not extended enhanced premium tax credits that are set to expire at the end of 2025, and nearly everyone who remains in the marketplaces will have to pay higher premiums, with the typical family of four with income of $65,000 paying $2,400 more per year. So Republicans are making healthcare more expensive for working families, while simultaneously cutting Medicaid for the poorest families, while simultaneously criminalizing specific types of healthcare for transgender families. And the through line here is suffering. The common denominator is children bearing the cost of Republican ideological commitments to tax cuts and culture war victories, and the systematic dismantling of the social safety net that emerged from the New Deal and Great Society eras. Now let's talk about what Representative Ramirez said about children being orphaned by violently abducting their parents, because this references the immigration policies that have been and continue to be a source of profound child trauma under Republican administrations. The family separation policy that the Trump administration implemented as a deliberate deterrent strategy resulted in thousands of children being forcibly separated from their parents at the border, with many of those separations becoming permanent, because the government literally lost track of which children belonged to which parents, creating a cohort of effectively orphaned children whose trauma will last a lifetime. Nayara Guzman, a Mexican immigrant with pending asylum and visa applications, who was in the government's custody for about 34 hours, was detained on the way to visit her daughter in the neonatal intensive care unit 15 days after a cesarean section, and at the detention center had limited access to food and water, no bed or blankets, and no access to a breast pump. We are talking about a government that detained a woman who had just had major surgery while her newborn was in the NICU, denying her the ability to pump breast milk, subjecting her to conditions that would constitute torture if applied to any other population, and Republicans call this border security. Representative Ramirez herself has a husband who could be among hundreds of thousands of people facing possible deportations because he is a DACA recipient, and she has been vocal about the fear that immigrant families live with every single day under Republican immigration policies that treat human beings as invaders and criminals rather than people seeking safety and opportunity. Her mom was pregnant with her when she crossed the Rio Grande, a detail Ramirez made a point to include in her campaign bio, noting that her mom went on to work multiple low-wage jobs to give her children a fighting chance to escape poverty. So when Representative Ramirez talks about children suffering under Republican policies, she's not speaking from abstract principle, She's speaking from lived experience, from family history, from the knowledge of what it means to be targeted and dehumanized by political rhetoric that treats immigrants as less than fully human. And she's right to call out the strip searches and criminalization of children at the border, because that is exactly what has been documented repeatedly by human rights organizations and journalists who have witnessed the conditions in which migrant children are held. Children in cages became a symbol of Trump-era immigration policy, but the reality is even worse than the symbol, because we're talking about children denied adequate food and water, and medical care and educational services, held in facilities that were never designed for long-term detention, separated from family members who could provide comfort and support, traumatized in ways that will affect their mental health and development for the rest of their lives. The American Academy of Pediatrics has been unequivocal that detaining children in these conditions constitutes a form of child abuse, and Republicans have not only continued these policies, but expanded them and celebrated them as necessary enforcement. So when Representative Ramirez says that the Republican Party is quickly becoming the party of child suffering, she is providing an accurate summary of Republican policy priorities across multiple domains, and the evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible. If you are willing to look at it honestly, rather than retreating into both sides' centrism or concerns about civility. Republicans are aligned behind sweeping budget cuts that would harm the most vulnerable people in our country, including America's kids, enacting policies that cut basic needs supports for families with children by slashing funding for food assistance, health care, and programs that support foster care, the portions of SNAP and Medicaid cuts that likely affect kids, plus the elimination and gutting of federal dollars passed to states to support families, would add up to one of the largest ever cuts to programs that support children, and this is not happening because of fiscal necessity or economic constraint. This is happening because Republicans are choosing to prioritize tax cuts that disproportionately benefit wealthy Americans and corporations over investments in children who need support to thrive. The moral obscenity of this should be obvious, but apparently it needs to be stated explicitly because we live in a political culture that treats both parties as equally valid options with different but reasonable philosophical approaches to governance. No, there is nothing reasonable about making children go hungry so that billionaires can get tax breaks. There is nothing defensible about denying health care to transgender youth because of religious objections that have no basis in medical science. There is nothing acceptable about traumatizing immigrant children through family separation and detention as a deterrent strategy. These are policy choices that inflict suffering on children, and Representative Ramirez is correct to name them as such, and to demand that her colleagues vote against legislation that perpetuates this suffering. A national survey from the Trevor Project found that 90% of LGBTQ+ youth said recent politics had negatively affected their mental health, and that's not because these young people are inherently fragile or oversensitive. That's because they are watching the United States Congress debate whether they deserve to exist, whether they should be allowed to access medical care, whether their doctors should go to prison for helping them. Rodrigo Hengleitanen of the Trevor Project said the organization's counselors regularly hear from trans and non-binary youth who express fear and anxiety and deep concern over the anti-transgender politics they're hearing about in the news. And so many young people have expressed that gender-affirming care made their lives better and allowed them to lead healthy, happy, successful lives. We are talking about healthcare that saves lives, that reduces suicidality, that allows young people to grow into healthy adults, and Republicans want to criminalize it because it doesn't conform to their ideological preferences about gender. The bill that just passed the House would also subject healthcare providers to a sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison and a significant fine for violations, and even helping a trans teenager cross state lines or access telehealth services for care could result in a decade-long prison sentence, with parents potentially implicated if they administer medication prescribed for their children. Read that again and let it sink in, because we are talking about parents potentially going to prison for giving their own children medication prescribed by a licensed physician. We are talking about criminalizing basic parental rights to make medical decisions for children in consultation with healthcare providers. We are talking about the federal government inserting itself into the most intimate family decisions and threatening prosecution for choices that every major medical organization supports as appropriate care. This is authoritarianism dressed up in the language of child protection, and it is grotesque. And the timing here matters enormously, because this is happening in December 2025, with the House scheduled to take up the measure on December 17, right before the holidays, right when people are focused on family gatherings and end-of-year celebrations, and Republicans are using this moment to push through legislation that will cause immense suffering to families with transgender children. Major medical institutions, including Children's National in Washington, D.C., and Children's Hospital in Los Angeles have announced the shutdown of pediatric gender-affirming care services, citing the legal and regulatory risk. So the chilling effect is already happening. Providers are already so terrified of prosecution and liability that they are shutting down care for patients who desperately need it, and the House just voted to make that chilling effect federal law. Representative Ramirez concluded her speech by urging her colleagues to vote no, and to build a future where children have everything they need to thrive, and that aspiration should not be controversial. It should be the baseline expectation for any society that claims to value children and family and human dignity. But we don't live in that society. We live in a society where Marjorie Taylor Greene frames the bill as one of President Trump's key campaign promises and executive orders, saying every Republican campaign to protect kids from the trans agenda, turning the existence of transgender children into an agenda that must be defeated rather than recognizing them as human beings who deserve care and support. The language here reveals everything, because when you talk about a trans agenda, you are denying the reality of transgender people's existence. You are treating their identity as a political project rather than a lived experience. You are making it possible to inflict suffering on them because they are no longer fully human in your ideological framework. And let's be absolutely clear about what this means for families, because parents describe the legislation as life-altering, with one Texas parent of a transgender teenager saying her family relocated out of state after losing access to care, and stating that no politician should be in any doctor's office or living room making private healthcare decisions. Families are being forced into exile within their own country, forced to uproot their lives and leave communities and jobs and extended family networks because the state where they live has decided their child doesn't deserve medical care. Nearly the entire South has banned gender-affirming care for youth, and as of July 2024, it takes a trans kid living in Atlanta almost 7 hours' drive to reach a gender clinic. So we're talking about families having to travel for hours or move to entirely different states just to access medical appointments that used to be available locally, and the financial and emotional burden of that is staggering. The intersection of all these policies that Representative Ramirez outlined creates a comprehensive picture of Republican governance that is fundamentally hostile to children's well-being, particularly children from marginalized communities. Poor children will go hungry from SNAP cuts. Children in low-income families will lose health care from Medicaid cuts. Transgender children will be denied medical care or have to flee their home states. Immigrant children will be separated from parents and detained in inhumane conditions. Children whose parents can't meet work requirements will see household benefits reduced. Children in families that lose ACA subsidies will either become uninsured or see their parents struggle to afford premiums. The cumulative effect is an assault on childhood itself, a systematic disinvestment in the next generation, a political movement that claims to be pro-life and pro-family while implementing policies that immiserate millions of actual living children. Analysis shows that the proposed cuts to Medicaid and SNAP would lead to more than 1 million lost jobs, with workers in healthcare and the food industry losing jobs without federal funds flowing through the system, and communities facing closure of rural hospitals and grocery stores, decreased tax revenue, and subsequent employment effects. So the harm extends beyond the direct beneficiaries of these programs to entire communities and regional economies that depend on this federal investment. When you cut SNAP, you're not just cutting food assistance, you're cutting revenue for grocery stores that employ people in those communities. When you cut Medicaid, you're not just cutting healthcare, you're cutting the ability of rural hospitals to stay open and provide emergency services. The downstream effects ripple through society in ways that ultimately harm everyone, including people who don't receive these benefits directly, but who depend on functioning communities with adequate infrastructure and services. And the contrast with what Republicans are prioritizing couldn't be starker, because while they're cutting hundreds of billions from programs that feed and provide healthcare to children, they would spend trillions to extend the 2017 tax cuts while steering more money to the military and immigration enforcement, making good on several of Trump's campaign pledges, including no taxes on overtime or tips, albeit on a temporary basis. The fiscal priorities here reveal everything about what Republicans actually value, because they can always find trillions for tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy. They can always find billions for military budgets and border walls and immigration enforcement. But when it comes to feeding hungry children or providing health care to sick children or supporting transgender children's access to medical care, suddenly there's no money. Suddenly we have to cut spending. Suddenly we have to impose work requirements and means testing and bureaucratic barriers that make it harder for families to access support. Representative Ramirez's speech deserves to be remembered because it cuts through the sanitized political discourse that treats Republican policy positions as legitimate differences of opinion rather than moral catastrophes with real human consequences. She's not engaging in partisan point scoring, she's documenting harm, she's bearing witness to suffering, she's demanding accountability for choices that elected officials are making that will affect millions of children's lives and futures. She is the wife of a DACA recipient, the daughter of Guatemalan working immigrants, and knows firsthand the challenges and constant fear these families live every single day. So when she speaks about immigration policy and child suffering, she's speaking from direct knowledge of what these policies mean for real families trying to build lives in America. The phrase party of child suffering is going to be dismissed by Republicans and their media allies as inflammatory rhetoric, as partisan hyperbole, as Democrats being uncivil and divisive. But inflammatory doesn't mean inaccurate. Sometimes the accurate description of a thing sounds inflammatory because the thing itself is horrifying. If your policies are making children sick by cutting Medicaid and ending ACA subsidies, if your policies are making children hungry by cutting SNAP, if your policies are orphaning children by abducting their parents, if your policies are criminalizing children at the border, if your policies are denying life-saving gender-affirming care to transgender youth, then you are in fact causing child suffering, and it is appropriate to name that reality plainly and demand that it stop. The civility fetish in American political discourse has made us unable to call evil by its name, unable to say plainly that policies which harm children are bad and the people implementing them should be opposed, unable to draw moral lines that distinguish between legitimate policy disagreements and fundamental assaults on human dignity. What Representative Ramirez is offering here is moral clarity in an age of deliberate obfuscation. She's refusing to accept the framing that treats child poverty and hunger and medical neglect as unfortunate but unavoidable side effects of necessary fiscal restraint. She's insisting that we look directly at what these policies do to actual children and recognize that the harm is not incidental but central to the Republican project. And she's right to frame this in terms of love and care and protection, because those are the words Republicans use constantly to justify their policies. They claim to love children and care about families and want to protect the innocent, but their actual policy choices reveal that those claims are hollow, that the children they care about protecting are abstract and hypothetical, while the children who need food and health care and safety are expendable. The Protect Children's Innocence Act has a name that inverts its purpose, because there is nothing innocent about denying children medical care. There is nothing protective about threatening doctors with prison for following medical science. There is nothing loving about making families choose between staying in their home state and accessing health care for their child. It's Orwellian in the most literal sense, using language that means the opposite of what it describes, and we need to be willing to say that plainly, rather than treating the title as a good faith description of the bill's intent. This bill will harm children, full stop. It will make transgender youth less safe and less healthy, and more likely to experience depression and suicidality, and everyone who votes for it knows that because they've been told repeatedly by medical experts, and they simply don't care because their ideological commitment to opposing transgender rights trumps their concern for children's well-being. And this matters beyond the immediate policy outcomes, because the Supreme Court in June 2025 issued a decision in U.S. v. Scarametti, upholding Tennessee's ban on youth gender-affirming care, ruling that these bans do not violate the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, and with this ruling, challenges to state bans in federal courts will likely be dismissed, and the laws allowed to go into effect, so we have judicial approval for state-level bans, and now legislative action for federal criminalization and executive enthusiasm from an incoming Trump administration that has made attacking transgender rights a centerpiece of its agenda, creating a comprehensive assault from all three branches of government on the ability of transgender youth to access medical care. The systematic nature of this should alarm everyone regardless of whether you have any personal connection to transgender people, because once the government establishes the precedent that it can ban specific medical treatments based on ideological rather than scientific grounds, that power can be extended to other treatments and other populations in ways that threaten everyone's medical autonomy. Representative Ramirez ends by saying, "Let's build a future where our children have what they need to thrive," and that should be the easiest political statement to agree with. But in 2025, it's apparently a radical left-wing position, because building that future would require abandoning Republican commitments to tax cuts for the wealthy, and culture war victories and border militarization, and systematic disinvestment in social programs. It would require actually prioritizing children's needs over donor preferences and ideological commitments. It would require recognizing that transgender children are children who deserve care just like any other children. It would require acknowledging that immigrant children are children who deserve safety and dignity, regardless of their parents' documentation status. It would require accepting that poor children deserve food and health care, and educational opportunities that allow them to develop their full potential. These should not be controversial statements, but they are because we have one political party that has decided child suffering is an acceptable price to pay for achieving other policy goals. So yes, the Republican Party is becoming the party of child suffering, not through rhetorical excess, but through documented policy choices that inflict harm on millions of children across multiple dimensions of their lives. And Representative Delia Ramirez just delivered the floor speech that names that reality and demands accountability and resistance. We owe it to those children to recognize what's happening, to call it what it is without euphemism or both sides' equivocation, and to fight like hell to stop it, because the alternative is accepting that child suffering is just the price of Republican governance, and that is morally intolerable.